I'm Theresa. Welcome to my channel. Today I'm going to show you my latest project, which was made from scraps from this project, which is my the video I made last week. But this one was fun to make. That one was not. This is part of the Simplicity Learn to Sew patterns, and it is wonderful. It's so easy to make. I highly recommend it if you're learning to sew, or if you just want to make something that's easy. You can sit down and just make it, and there's no issues. And it's cute and comfortable. 2 thumbs up. I love it. So I'm going to show you the instructions really quick before I hop into the video. And I also made a little doll one. So I just kind of shrunk the pattern down to make a matching one for her doll. Yeah, so I'm going to go ahead and bring the camera over here and show you the instructions. What I love about this pattern is that it breaks everything down and explains a lot of the stuff that some of the other patterns just assume that you know. Getting started about this pattern, find your pattern size, how to prep your pattern, prep your fabric, how to pin the pattern to the fabric, and how to mark your fabric too, which is a lot of the stuff that if you've been sewing for a while, you just don't even have to think about. And you forget that when you are learning, you just don't know this stuff. And it has pretty much everything that you need to know to make it on here. It even has a little bit more sewing directions right here. Excuse my children screaming in the background. It's nap time. Alright, so let's go ahead and get started making this romper. And then at the end of the video, I'll show you how I made the doll romper. Here, I'm cutting out my pattern pieces. My layout is different than the directions because I'm using scraps to make this project. I use plain old rocks as pattern weights. Eventually, I want my kids to paint them, and then I'll have fancy rocks to weigh my pattern down. I just haven't gotten around to that yet. You can also pin your pattern down and use scissors. However, I found that the rotary cutter is much easier on my wrists, and it's also a lot faster, which is nice because this is my least favorite part of sewing. Once the pieces are cut out, we can move along to the directions. Step 1. With the right sides together, pin the front to the back at the side seams and crotch seam, matching the cut edges and notches. Stitch. To help the seams lay flat, clip the curves at the inner leg, being careful not to clip through the stitching. So first I lay the front and the back pieces together, laying them down as if the garment is inside out with the right sides together. I pin the side seams and then the inner leg. I then take it to my sewing machine and I sew those 3 sides together. Alright, so step 2 and 3. Press under the hem allowance on the armhole edges, pin hem in place, and stitch close to the cut edge. Step 3. Press under 1 inch along the neck edge of the front and the back, pin. To form the casing, stitch 1/4 inch from raw edge, leaving ends open to insert drawstring and tie end. So here I'm doing the hem under the arm. I'm first pressing up the raw edges, folding it over and pressing it down again. And then I sew it down. Moving on to step 3. I press under the raw edges and I fold them down, and then folding it over again by 1 inch and pressing it and pin it in place. I repeat these steps on the other side. And then I sew them down on the bottom edge only, making sure that the ends are open so I can string the drawstring through. With the right sides together, fold the drawstring and tie end in half lengthwise, matching the cut edges. Pin. Stitch outer edges of drawstring and 3/8 inch seam, leaving an opening at lower edge for turning. To help form a sharp point when turning, trim the corners of the drawstring, being careful not to cut through the stitching. Step 5. Turn each end of drawstring right side out. Press. Hand sew opening close. And their learn to sew tip is you can use a loop turner to turn the drawstring and tie end, or try using a pencil, placing the eraser end to the seamed end and push the pencil through the tube of the drawstring, and that will turn it right side out. So here, I'm folding my drawstring in half and I take it over to my machine and I sew it together, making sure to leave a space for turning it right side out. Then I clip the corners and I begin the process of turning it inside out. I'm using a loop turner. I use my needle to pick out the corners, and then I iron it down. The instructions have you hand sew the opening closed. I chose to sew a line down the whole drawstring, closing the hole that way. It's not as pretty, but it gets the job done. Alright, steps 6 and 7. Attach a safety pin to one end of drawstring. Insert the drawstring and tie end through the front and back casings, forming a loop at left shoulder, having loose ends extend evenly on the right side. Line up the stitching lines on the left side of drawstring with the armhole hem stitching. Baste along the stitching lines using a long machine stitch. Pull up drawstring, cinching the front and the back of romper until the second set of stitching lines meet the hem, stitching on the right side as shown. Baste along the stitching lines. Distribute fullness evenly. If necessary, adjust to fit comfortably. Stitch along the stitching lines as basted and remove the basting. The first thing that I did was transfer the stitch lines from the pattern piece onto my drawstring. Then I used a safety pin to pull it through the casing, making sure to line up the stitching lines. And then I sewed it down. Steps 9 and 10. 9. To keep the elastic from getting stuck in the seam allowances, as it is inserted through the casing, hand baste the seam allowances of side and crotch seams to garment 1 to 1/4 inch above the lower edge. And be sure to remove the basting when the casing is finished. Step 10. Press up 5/8 inch on the leg edge pin to form the casing. Stitch close to raw edge, leaving an opening along the crotch seam to insert elastic. It's easier to stitch the casing in a circle if you keep the right side of the leg against the machine with the inside facing you and the needle inside the circle as shown. I skipped step 9. I've never found it necessary to baste the seams down, but if you're worried about stringing the elastic through, then you should do it. So here I fold over the raw edge and I iron it down, and then I fold it up a finger width and I iron it down again. This forms the casing for the elastic. Then I take it over to my machine and I sew it down, making sure to leave a space so that I can string the elastic through. Step 11. Cut a piece of elastic for each leg opening, the length of the leg elastic guide. Attach a safety pin to the end of the elastic and insert the safety pin and elastic through the opening in the casing. Thread the elastic all the way through until it emerges from the other side of the opening. Overlap ends 5/8 inch and hold with a safety pin. Step 12. Stitch ends of elastic together securely. Step 13. Stitch the opening closed. Distribute fullness evenly around the casing. Learn to sew tip. To secure elastic so it won't twist while wearing, stitch through all thicknesses of the casing in the groove of each seam. So here I'm using a safety pin to string my elastic through, and then I sew the elastic together. The last thing I do is sew the hole in the casing closed. And then I put it on my little dress form. And it's done! And now I'm going to show you how I made the doll romper. The first thing I had to do was make the template or pattern. I taped 2 pieces of paper together and I drew a small romper. I double checked the length by sitting the doll on the paper and rolling him backwards so that it would fit both when he was standing and when he was sitting. Then I folded the paper in half and I cut it out. I got my scraps out and I laid them down facing each other, and I used my rotary cutter to cut them out. This next step is different than the baby romper. I sewed the crotch seam first. The legs are too small to easily hem them once the side seams are sewn, so I took it over to my ironing pad and I folded up the leg hole hems and I ironed them down. And I took them to my sewing machine and I sewed them down. I did serge the ends. This makes it quick to hem because you only have to fold it once instead of twice. Then I sewed the side seams down with my serger. Next, I ironed the armhole hem under and I sewed it down. Then I tried it on the doll. I figured a 1-inch fold on the front and the back would work fine. And I ironed it and sewed it down, forming the casing for the elastic. Instead of using a drawstring, I decided to use the elastic because it's easier for her to dress in. And then I took a safety pin and I guided the elastic through the casing. I put it on the doll to adjust the elastic length. And then I cut it and sewed it together. Then I encased the sewed end of the elastic in the casing. Now, to mimic the tied drawstring, I made a quick bow out of the remaining scraps and I sewed it onto the front right side of the romper, and it's done. If you made it this far into the video, tell me in the comments, and don't forget to like and subscribe, and as always, thanks for watching.